Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Neil Lanctot, the author of The Approaching Storm, Roosevelt, Wilson, Addams, and Their Clash Over America's Future. His writing has appeared in many places, including the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Baltimore Sun. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Lanctot.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support. In keeping the show going, go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. To understand World War I and what brought the United States into it, we have to bring ourselves to a different America. In 1912, the wind was with the progressives. The government had a role to play in everyday life. 3 presidents were battling for the right to chart the future. Women were demanding suffrage. There was a new energy among scholars and journalists. But internationally, the emerging nation had not yet asserted itself. By 1914, the world was collapsing into a giant war. America had never sent its troops to another continent, and it didn't seem ready to. So, Dr. Lanctot, who was the first person to say, maybe what happens overseas is not only our business, but is something we should sacrifice our children for?
Well, it's an interesting point because what's going on in Ukraine right now is making a lot of people think about this very issue that arose 100 plus years ago with World War I in America. I think Theodore Roosevelt, of the 3 individuals who I wrote about in this book, was probably the most emphatic about America's role in the world, at least in 1914, 1915, when the war first begins. Roosevelt had this perspective very early on that, the United States, if we are going to be a great nation and a great power, we have responsibilities around the globe, and we have to step in when sort of international wrongdoing, as he would have called it, is being done, and we need to intervene. We need to stop. We need to throw all of our forces against it. But that's going to be a tough sell in America in 1914, 1915, because most Americans they see that as the other side of the world, and they're not willing to send troops there, and they don't see it necessarily as relevant to their lives. But over time, it will start seeing a little bit more relevant. But again, I'm seeing a lot of parallels, and I've been asked this on a couple of other programs I've been on about the situation in Ukraine, situation in 1914, when Americans sort of have to decide what is our role when a sovereign nation is invaded. When the Germans invaded Belgium in 1914, and that was a very, very catastrophic situation in Europe and great concern to many, many people, and many Americans were extremely troubled by it, but not enough to really want to go fight there. There's a lot of sympathy, but there was an unwillingness to go further. So that's going to be the issue in this book, is sort of America slowly but surely moving towards eventual involvement in this horrible European war.
And we're certainly going to get deeper into that, but I want to introduce some of the characters first. Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Jane Addams, 2 Ds in Addams, by the way. It's tempting to start with the presidents because so much of our discourse starts with what they do and with what they say, and it seems natural to go with them first. But let's start with Jane Addams today. Who is she, and when did you decide that her life deserves an equal plane with the giants, 2 of these giants of American history?
Jane Addams has been so forgotten in the 21st century, and it's really, really a shame because she was so important in her own time. And I think in the early 1900s, she was probably one of the most famous women in America. She might have been number 1. If not number 1, I always say Helen Keller might have been number 1, Addams number 2. She was someone who had made her name as a social worker at first. I mean, she had helped establish Hull House in Chicago, which ministered to the poor and the immigrant community of Chicago. But from there, she used that as a jumping off point to all kinds of involvement in liberal causes. And by the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, she was almost one of the most foremost liberals in the country and a big part of what we call the progressive movement. I mean, she was involved in the suffrage movement. She was involved in the civil rights movement. She was involved in all kinds of reforms, so much so that she worked with Roosevelt when he was president. She went to the White House a number of times to consult with him. And when Roosevelt ran for president in 1912 with the Progressive Party, the new Progressive Party, Adams seconded his nomination. So she was someone who had her fingers in a lot of different pies as a liberal and a progressive, but her great cause at this time became pacifism, and that's what made me use her in this book as the third character. I mean, all these three knew each other, Adams, Roosevelt, and Wilson. They knew each other, interacted with one another, they worked together at different times, but they had very different views on how America should address this war. And Adams is going to be the pacifist conscience of the three.
What I thought was amazing is what you just said, is that they all had relationships with one another. So how did Adams encounter Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt?
Well, Adams had known Roosevelt just from being a progressive. And she found that Roosevelt was one of the first presidents who was willing to hear social issues, social science issues, social work issues. And she visited the White House many times. And Roosevelt liked her because he sometimes thought some of the reformers were a little bit out there. And there's a letter in their correspondence where Roosevelt writes to Adams and says, if all the reformers were like you're a sane reformer and you're very level-headed, and I'm willing to hear your views. So she found him very receptive. On the other hand, she wasn't thrilled with some of Roosevelt's militaristic tendencies, but she was willing to set that aside to support Roosevelt when he ran for president in 1912, because the Progressive Party of 1912 with Roosevelt was promising just about every kind of liberal progressive cause at the time.
Could she could she deal with the masculinity of Teddy Roosevelt? Was that a sticking point back then, as it is among some scholars today?
I think she knew what he was all about, and she understood him. She didn't necessarily approve of it. I think she saw the good points in him, that he could be a very, as I said, very ahead of his time in certain things, but yes, obsessed with masculinity, obsessed with, in some ways, military things. And there's even letters in Adams' correspondence where some of her friends are saying, how can you support Teddy Roosevelt for president in 1912? That man is, he wants 20 battleships, things like that. So
20.
She pretty much said, well, that's okay. I can set that part of him aside. There's a lot of other things that he's for that I'm for. So, we overlap in certain areas. That's cool. When World War I began, she begins to have a very different attitude, because Roosevelt decides, America has a role in this war. Adams is going to be pushing for, let's try to find some sort of way to bring peace. And Roosevelt believes this is completely foolish. Adams is being silly, and the women that are behind her are silly, and any attempt for pacifist views during World War I are completely wrong-headed. So they will pretty much split. And their contact will be a lot less during these years of 1914 to 17. But Roosevelt still keeps in touch with her a little bit. He goes to visit her in Chicago at one point when he's thinking of running for president. So I think he realizes her influence. I mean, Adams had a huge amount of influence in America at this time as someone who a lot of women looked up to, and a lot of men did too. But she's going to do some things that make her quite unpopular. And one of them is going to be her views on the war before even America gets involved in 1917.
We've spent a lot of time on this show talking about the President's Club and ex-presidents and how they get along with one another. What was the relationship like between TR, who left office in 1909, and Woodrow Wilson, who then succeeds the successor to Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft? What was the relationship like between TR and Woodrow Wilson, and why was it awful?
Well, you gave away my punchline there.
Yeah. But you can make it. You can do it again if you want.
They hated each other. At one point, they had been fairly friendly. I mean, they'd known each other from like maybe the late 1890s, and when Roosevelt was first president, they'd gotten along. At that time, Wilson was president of Princeton. There's some little letters back and forth. And at one point, Roosevelt invited Wilson to the White House. But they began to differ and begin to disagree on the direction America should go. And they're both progressives, but they have different attitudes about the role of the government, things like that. By 1914, when Roosevelt had been out of office for 5 years by this point, he had come to absolutely despise Wilson. It was almost pathological how much he hated this man. And anyone who reads my book can just see the number of insults he rained upon him during this period. I mean, and Wilson, it's funny, Wilson basically said, I will never respond to him because I know that irritates him so much that I don't respond to him directly. So the more that Wilson ignored him was more frustrating than ever. Their disagreement during this time becomes, how do we handle what's going on in Europe during the war? How do we handle the Germans? How do we handle the Allies? America's going to be caught in between these two sides during the period before we go to war from 1914 to 17. And as Americans start getting caught in the crossfire when they're traveling, on ships headed to Europe, and German submarines are sinking them and American lives are being lost, that's going to become a major issue. The Lusitania is the most famous example of that tension.
Yeah, I do have a couple questions about that moment of spark. But before we get to some of that stuff, I want to ask about the book itself. I'm curious about the sources that you plumbed for this. And this is a beautifully written book without any question. It's a very crisp and very, easy and digestible way to read about World War I. And I've had authors on the show who have criticized books of this length. Just to be honest with you, some, have said, why would anyone need a 600-page book or whatever pages they said? In some circles, anything more than 250 now is too long. And I have to say, I really enjoy every once in a while picking up a book of longer length. Maybe that's just me. Maybe that's because of my Robert Caro fandom. But I loved picking up this beautifully produced book that has really nice kind of silky pages to it, and the words and the writing are so great in it. So, how did you approach the writing of this book? What were your sources? And then why did you feel as though it needed the 600 pages to tell this story in full?
First of all, thank you for your kind words, and your point about the length of the book is well taken. It seems like many nonfiction books or history books, it seems like you're right, the magic number is like no more than 300 pages, 250 to 300.
And sometimes it's fine. I mean, it really is okay.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes you can do a topic in that amount. When I wrote this book, I don't think I have to tell the story. I'm not even going to take any sort of word limit or page limit. I'm just going to write it and see what it comes out to be. Unfortunately, it came out to be a little bit long, but I felt it was necessary. That this is a complex subject and a complex issue with three different characters, and I was sort of hoping that the sweep of it, sort of the scope of it would be something that would be appealing to readers. I didn't think I could do it in a more superficial manner. And if I did, I feel like I would be cheating the readers. I mean, these figures have been written about before, but to write about them in such a detailed fashion over this period, I think I had to make it longer. So that was probably the reason why it turned out the length it came out to being. As far as the sources, that's one of the reasons why the book is probably a little bit long, because there are so many sources. All of these individuals wrote many, many letters. This was an era where much of the business of the world was conducted by letters. It's probably one of the last generations of that, because by the 20s and 30s, people are using phones more and more. But in this era, phones are around, but they're not being used quite as much. So everyone's writing letters. Roosevelt wrote so many letters, and there's articles, there's letters in his correspondence where he's complaining to other people, saying, I get so many letters each day, I can't deal with this avalanche of letters. And he kept up a correspondence. Wilson, of course, as president, had many, many letters, and Adams did too. They all had it must have occupied a substantial part of their lives writing these letters. They all had probably stenographers, which was a long dead job, but in those days wasn't an important job where someone would take dictation and then type it out for the individual. But so to go through those letters was a big part of the writing and research of this book. I also made a lot of use of newspapers. I mean, I felt that was important to try to bring the period to life, and how best to is to read the newspapers. And this was an era where most big cities had 3 and 4 newspapers. So I tried to use the New York paper, Chicago, and Washington to start, and then supplement with others. And in those days, New York had like 8, 9, 10 newspapers. Now I didn't read 9, 10, but I could sometimes would read 3 and 4 for a particular event, because you would get a little different perspective each time. And you can see how the Republican papers might cover Roosevelt or Wilson a little bit differently than the Democratic papers. So people think today is a divided world, but it was divided in 1912, and the media was also divided. I mean, you could tell a paper was a Democratic paper in those days or a Republican paper by the way their spin on the news. So I tried to use those different sources as well. Diaries were very important. It was an era where people were keeping diaries. The most famous source in this book is Colonel House, Woodrow Wilson's friend and advisor, who kept this incredibly detailed diary for something like 10 years. Every day he'd go back and he would dictate what was happening. And he was someone who was very close to the halls of power, close to Wilson. Wilson sent him to Europe. So there's all kinds of wonderful nuggets in there from Colonel House. So there's all these sources, and you're trying to put them together and then distill them to something simple for the reader. And that's not always easy. I always say, when you write a book like this, it's like putting a puzzle together when the puzzle's supposed to be 500 pieces and you have 20,000 pieces. You know, there's just so much. What do you use? What don't you use?
As the pieces came together, as you read the papers, what similarities did you find between your big three, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Adams, that you didn't expect to find among people who, by all outward appearances, are very, very different, including the two presidents, who couldn't be more polar opposite in their demeanor?
I think they all realized how important the war was, even if America wasn't involved in it, and that this was going to be something very defining for us as a country, and that the right decision had to be made, that this was going to have great ramifications one way or the other. So I think they all agreed on that. And I think also they were all liberals, you know, and you know, you couldn't put them necessarily in the same pot, but I think they all leaned left. Addams by far was the most liberal of the three. I think she would almost be still liberal. Her views would put her in the liberal category in the 21st century, whereas the other two, some of their views are certainly retrogressive, and certainly Wilson's racial views, which I don't really get into too much in this book, but it's touched on a little bit, put him in a very problematic area as well. But I do think from the perspective of what this war means to the United States and what we have to do, I mean, I think they saw that it was going to be a very important decision for the country to make, but they had different views of what that decision should be. And the interesting thing is that I think Addams believed that Wilson was on her side. And you see in my book how, you know, Wilson is kind of chumming up to the pacifists, and they come to the White House, they talk to him, and they all think he's on their side. He's never going to take the country into war. And then as it turns out, in the very end, Wilson does take the country into war. Whereas Roosevelt thought Wilson never would. He believed he would never fight. He would never take the country into war. And Wilson does and becomes a wartime president, which is a whole other matter. So you have these tensions among the three. They're a very interesting trio of individuals. I really think so. I mean, I think they really, in many ways, epitomize the progressive era and the world of America at that time.
How should we train ourselves to think about the parties of that era? These days, it's, you know, our political parties are very neatly aligned geographically. If you're liberal on race, you're often liberal on things like, financial and fiscal politics, and vice versa. If you're conservative on social issues, you're often conservative on fiscal issues. The parties did not line up nearly as neatly back then, and really not until maybe even, the 1980s or 90s where things more aligned. So how do we think about, and how should we think about the way the parties worked back then and who was sort of with who?
baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Yeah, that's an interesting question and a question that is complicated. It all comes down to progressives and progressivism. It's like I have trouble explaining to my students and them understanding it. But I'll give you the quick and dirty version of it. The Democratic Party, at this point, there was a progressive wing and a less progressive wing. I mean, the Northeast would be the more progressive wing. Wilson was a progressive, and then you have the Southern Democrats who would be on the conservative end, and certainly very, very conservative on racial issues, many more segregationists. In the Republican Party, you had, again, a split between conservatives and progressives. The conservative end would have been people like William Howard Taft. The liberal end or progressive end would have been Roosevelt. And when Roosevelt couldn't get the nomination in 1912, he split the party with his followers and formed the Progressive Party. It took a lot of Republicans with him. So you had that split. And there was really a fight on for the Republican Party, whether it was going to become a more liberal party or a more conservative party. Now, Roosevelt, and I get into this in the book, tried to run for president in 1916 again. He was hoping that the Republicans would take him back. He knew the Progressive Party would nominate him, and they did. But he was not going to run again unless the Republicans would also nominate him, and they wanted no part of him in 1916. It was sort of a punishment because they felt he had split the party and made Wilson president in 1912. So that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. But both sides have a progressive and a conservative wing. Fiscally, probably the Republicans would have been more the more conservative in that area, and more conservative, more of the big business party. The Democrats would have been considered more of the rural party. You have William Jennings Bryan, who had many followers all around the country, who was Wilson's Secretary of State for a couple of years, who was a Democrat. So you have that as well as part of the picture. Another issue is women's suffrage. At this point, there are 12 suffrage states. So they have some importance to voting, and that's why Jane Addams has some importance, because Addams is an influential figure, and Wilson knew that, and Wilson felt that it was important for him to kind of keep in touch with Addams. And eventually in 1916, for the presidential election, Addams, who had supported Roosevelt in 1912, will support Woodrow Wilson that year. And many of the pacifists, and actually the progressives, many of the old Progressive Party, which falls apart in 1916, will vote for Wilson.
This book is by and large about how America goes from being isolationist to being interventionist, and that journey that the country goes through. So briefly describe how World War I started from a single bullet, essentially, and becomes this worldwide calamity that claims millions of lives and then sets the world on a path to an even worse world war. So, but I guess don't even get to World War II. Just how did we go from this one assassination to, an out of control war that's being fought on numerous fronts and then drags in several continents worth of countries?
Well, it's all these alliances in Europe, which are all tied together. Part of it is a German miscalculation. I don't think they ever believed it was going to snowball in what it turned into. Austria-Hungary felt they had to punish Serbia for that assassination, and that set off a chain reaction of Russia saying, if you do this, we're going to mobilize our troops, and then the Germans looked for a chance to kind of go for Russia. So it's a chain reaction that occurs, but probably the important link in the chain was when the British got involved. The British decided that if the Germans went into Belgium on the way to France to fight the French, they were going to involve themselves in the war. And when they do, that makes the war a global war. And there's a quote in the book where I think, I don't know, it was the Kaiser, or one of the German officials said something like, we're going to be very hard to beat them now because the British are a stubborn race. This has changed the entire complexion of the war. So suddenly you have these two alliances going at it. You have France, Great Britain, and Russia fighting Germany and Austria-Hungary. Later on, Italy joins the Allied side. And the war eventually spreads throughout the entire world. It truly is a global war. It's like nothing that anyone had seen. Seems like something out of the Napoleonic era. No one thought there could be that kind of war in Europe in 1914. For America, I think people were shocked. They weren't sure what to do. And Wilson immediately told the country that, what we need to do is remain neutral in thought and in action. Wilson had this idea that if we kind of keep our poise, we as a nation will be of great help in bringing peace to the combatants at some point, and we will have a place in reshaping the world after the war. That's what Wilson was hoping to do.
And why was America so isolationist? What is it? Just because we hadn't done it before? We hadn't made the adventure yet? The Civil War obviously was a very traumatic time for the country. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Was that memory kind of lingering? And, maybe it's sort of like the Iraq War today in terms of our adventures overseas and how that impacts the psyche of people who say no more war overseas?
I think the average American could not see how this affected them. There were a lot of editorials after the war began where newspaper journalists are writing things like, "Oh, thank God our ancestors left that Europe with all their problems and their militarism and their fighting, and we're so thankful that we are blessed by being protected by two oceans." So it's the idea that that's a whole other world away. It's not affecting us directly. Our national security does not seem to be at stake. We had a very small army, and this becomes an issue in the book, which I cover quite a bit in the book, of how small the military was. We had a decent-sized Navy, but our army wasn't much of anything. We were not a militaristic country, and there was an actual recoiling among many Americans for any touch of militarism. Part of it was a lot of the immigrants who had come here had fled countries with militarism and service and things like that. So they don't want any part of it here. And I have a quote in the book where something like, people were even afraid that the Boy Scouts were teaching boys to become too militaristic. So there was no real culture of militarism in this country, and there was no perception that there was a threat, with maybe the exception of parts of, I think the East Coast was always the most militaristic as far as, probably because they had the greatest connection to Europe and the greatest connection to the United Kingdom and France. But if you got into the hinterlands of the United States at this time, most Americans would say, this doesn't really affect us. It would be nice if the Germans were defeated. We certainly prefer the Allies, but we are not going to surrender our blood and treasure to make sure the Allies win. And that view, I think, persists for a long time. Even after we get involved in the war in 1917, there still is ambivalence until the propaganda machine really gets up and running in 1917 into 1918. But I think it's not like World War II. I think there's a great difference in America with World War I and World War II as far as the support for the war and the clear public groundswell of rallying behind the cause.
Why does it? You mentioned the sinking of the Lusitania. Why does America always seem to need an exclamation point before it gets involved? I mean, I'm going to run through a few of them. I'm sure a historian could quibble with some of my examples, but Pearl Harbor, 9/11, the Lusitania. What is it about this country that, we kind of meander through foreign policy until it's like, bam, on the Lusitania, 150 Americans are suddenly dead, and now what?
I think it's a matter of Americans not really knowing much about foreign policy. So it takes almost an example which is so pronounced, so in your face, that they finally understand it. It's like 1 + 1 = 2. Now I get it. There's a quote in the book from Roosevelt where he says, our people are very ignorant about foreign affairs. That was true in 1914. I think it's true in the 21st century. I think many Americans even now don't have a really strong grasp about what's caused the war in Ukraine right now, what's happening on that side of the world. Foreign affairs I think, are a difficult thing for people to master, especially from the media that many people, consume then and now. It may have been better in those days because people read newspapers, where people don't read newspapers as much anymore. At least in the newspaper era, people saw world news and saw global affairs a little bit more. But in general, I think most Americans have never really been that up on foreign affairs. So it takes some sort of dramatic episode or event to finally for it to sink in, as okay, now I understand. Now it makes sense to me. We have to do what needs to be done in this situation.
One of the things I thought was so interesting about your book is how women, and Addams in particular, but how women and advocates for peace in general had to thread a certain needle when it came to this push for war. There were more considerations that women had to think about when they injected themselves into this debate over whether the United States should be involved or not.
Yeah, one of the concerns was, is it going to affect the suffrage movement? If we as women are opposing American involvement or we're pushing pacifism, there were those who opposed women's suffrage who said, well, this just shows you how women are too emotional and too silly and should not get the vote in the first place. This is a rationalization for them. And even when we get to 1917, when we're about to vote on the war, and the new Congresswoman Rankin from Montana, she's the first. Jeanette Rankin is the first female in Congress. She is someone who is a pacifist, and she's also very much a suffragist too. And there's a great deal of pressure on her to make sure she votes the right way. There's some people on the suffrage side saying you have to vote for war. It's going to go through anyway. And if you don't vote for war, it's going to harm the suffrage cause. And so she was under that kind of pressure. And I think a lot of other women at this time are going to be, what's more important, suffrage or pacifism? And some women will choose suffrage. They believe that that's the most important thing right now. Pacifism, yes, is important. Ending the war in Europe is important, but not as important as women getting the right to vote in the United States. Addams didn't feel that way. I think she saw them all related as part of the same package deal. She was not going to, she never will go out there and go rah, rah, rah for World War I when war begins, because she still believes that it's the 20th century and we should be solving international problems through some sort of concerted effort, international effort, rather than through blowing each other up. That's really her philosophy. I mean, when I say pacifist for Jane Addams, she's not a pacifist in the sense that people think she's about nonviolence, but she probably was to a certain degree. But she more believes that there should be better ways to solve difficulties between countries than war. That's what she pushes for. And when we do go to war, as I said, she's going to become a pariah for a while in the United States because she doesn't really go out there and trumpet the war effort. And eventually, the Wilson administration will find something for her to do. She'll go work for the Food Administration with Herbert Hoover. Hoover was the head of the Food Administration, which was one of these federal agencies to help the country preserve food for the war effort. So she was okay doing something like that, but she was not going to do anything more for the war effort.
On Woodrow Wilson, who wins maybe one of the most incredible presidential races ever. Three giants of history are clashing in this race in 1912, and Woodrow Wilson is up against William Howard Taft and former President Roosevelt. And, TR, a lot of people say, was the most famous person in the world at that time. And Woodrow Wilson is sort of, in some ways, this kind of sleepy guy who was college professor and president of Princeton, and he was from the South. And he also, at least several years into his presidency, becomes kind of slow, and he maybe not mentally slow, but certainly physically, the ravages of time had taken its toll on him at a relatively young age. And he's just kind of a confounding figure. He's sort of progressive on certain issues domestically, the role of the federal government in improving people's lives, but he's also got this racist streak that runs through him, and he makes segregation worse in the federal government. He's just a confounding figure. He also goes through in your book a period of depression and then a period of finding love again. And so I'm just wondering, you can certainly sketch out some of Woodrow Wilson here if you want, but I'm also wondering how his sort of mental metamorphosis paralleled his journey towards America could maybe intervene in this war. Is that too much of a connection to make?
No, I don't think it is. And I think his mental health probably did affect some of his decision making at times. And as you mentioned, his wife dies right when the war is beginning in 1914. He really literally has a breakdown. There's a quote in the book where Colonel House, his friend, writes it in the diary of how he and Wilson are walking in the streets of New York, and Wilson told him, "I wish someone would just shoot me. But I'll have to. I'm not going to kill myself. But if someone shot me, I would feel relieved because I can't go on like this." I mean, he's just in the depths of pain from the loss of his wife. So it's very, very difficult for him the first, I think, 4 or 5 months in late 1914 to early 1915. And then, lo and behold, in March 1915, he meets this widow, Edith Galt, and falls head over heels in love with her. And that's one of the interesting parts of the book is these letters that the two of them exchange.
I can barely read them. It's like really kind of personal to read through these letters, these love letters. Not as bad as Harding's letters, but hey.
No, they're not. And I only use little bits of them, but some of them are they're almost so sickeningly sweet. And the public would have probably been shocked if they had seen that Wilson, because everyone kind of saw Wilson as, he's this academic, he looks stiff, he's got his certain look to him. And here he is writing these very hot and heavy letters back and forth of how much he's a man madly in love. He asked her to marry her after a month, and he does marry her at the end of 1915. It's a very, very quick courtship and marriage. He was someone
He's the president. He's the president. I mean, he's asking someone to marry him while he's president,
As I said in the book, he doesn't know her that well. He starts sharing secrets with her. He's passing on these documents, and I think she loves it. She's enjoying every bit of being his confidant and learning what's going on in the government. And she kind of manipulates him into writing, saying, I'm disappointed you didn't send me the newest envelope with all the tidbits of what's going on in the State Department right now. So she plays him to a certain degree. Not saying she didn't love him, but I think she also was ambitious. But I think, probably as his mental health got a little better and he really became stronger, and as a person, I think maybe he began to see America's role a little bit more emphatically. He was someone, I think, also who was incredibly politically astute. And I'm not sure if I brought that up enough in the book, but he had almost complete control of the party. He was able to control all the different parts of the Democratic Party and get them to do his bidding. He controlled Congress, which was democratically controlled, in the palm of his hand. And he also sort of knew what the public wanted to hear and do. He was, as I mentioned in the book, he was always trying to thread a very difficult needle during these years of keeping the country out of war, but also being tough enough to make sure that we don't appear weak around the world as well. Now, Roosevelt would disagree with him and say he's not being strong enough, but I think what he was doing was satisfactory to most Americans. And eventually he does pretty much give an ultimatum to Germany in 1916 with the sinking of the Sussex. Pretty much says, we are going to sever ties with you, and the next step will be war, and the Germans do back down. So I think Wilson became more assertive and a little stronger, and became, I think, more familiar with foreign affairs, because that really was not his forte. He's got to learn on the job. He was someone who was more of a domestic policy guy, and suddenly he's going to be thrown into dealing with this incredible situation in Europe.
And Wilson becomes a transformational president, certainly foreign policy-wise, also on race in this country, unfortunately, in the way he transformed it. How did America finally get involved? How did Woodrow Wilson begin to marshal the unrealized power and expanse of the United States?
I think Wilson was hoping we could stay out of the war up until late 1916, but he knew what was coming. I mean, it's a situation where our hand is forced by Germany. The Germans knew they couldn't win a long war. So they wanted to get the war wrapped up as soon as possible in 1916, maybe early 1917. And they were hoping that the United States could assist them, bring the sides to the peace table, and then get lost. We'll hash it out. The Germans were leading at this time too, so they were hoping we can get the war done. We keep our gains. We're done. That's it. If America could not get both sides to the peace table, the Germans already warned Wilson that we're going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which they had pulled back on because they were afraid of involving America. Wilson saw this coming, so he himself floated a peace balloon at the end of 1916 to both sides, like saying, can't we find some common ground to talk? Both sides pretty much rejected it, so that didn't go anywhere. And at that point, the Germans made a decision, okay, there's not going to be any peace. We're going to resume unrestricted warfare in early 1917. The Americans will probably get involved, but it'll be too late. By the time they can put together a decent-sized military force to send to Europe, we will have starved the British into submission, and the war will be over by the end of 1917. That was the plan. It was not necessarily the right plan, but that was the plan that the higher-ups in the German government, the military and the Navy, thought was the right way to go. So Wilson will be faced with that the Germans are resuming unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917. He's also going to learn the Zimmermann telegram, where the Germans had sent that telegram to Mexico, the embassy of Mexico, basically saying, if war comes, if you tie up American troops on the border, we'll allow you to go ahead and seize territory that had once belonged to you, which are currently American states. It was a crazy cockamamie idea. The British intercepted this message and they turned it over to the American authorities, and this was made public in the early 1917. This got people quite agitated about the war situation. But even then, Wilson was still pulling back, was hoping that the Germans would behave themselves up until the end. But then there started to be sinkings of ships. I think there were 3 in March with American deaths. At that point, he knew we have to go to war. And I think he had also come to the belief that America had to be involved in the war if we were going to have any say in the peace conference that was going to come in the future. There's a scene in the book where Addams came to see Wilson in the White House in early 1917, and it's a very discouraging talk she has with him because she's trying to find a way to avoid war. And Wilson pretty much says, well, we're going to have to go to war because if we don't, I won't even be able to get into the peace conference through a crack in the door. And I need to be at the peace conference. I need to, America needs to be there so we can remake the post-war world. We're going to have a League of Nations and all these wonderful things. So I think Wilson never really wanted to go, but he felt it was inevitable by the spring of 1917. And that's how we end up involved in the Great War.
What became of Jane Addams? She wins just about every civil award, every big civil award someone can win. Where did she wind up after taking part in this vigorous and consequential debate?
Well, she was sort of tarred as a radical. She had a difficult time during the war. And even after the war, she still had this reputation as being, she was a pacifist during the war. She's a free thinker. You have the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Hoover, as people are keeping tabs on her in the 1920s. They're tapping her. They're showing up at some of her appearances. There's people like the ROTC calling her the most dangerous woman in America. So in the 20s, there's a real backlash against anything that smells of radicalism. By the early 30s, even in the late 20s, there's a whole turnaround. People start seeing her as this wonderful woman who'd done great things. There's also a whole rejection of World War I and America's involvement. By 1930, people feel it was a great mistake for the United States. We never should have been involved in this war, which is going to be a problem for Franklin Roosevelt later on, because so many Americans will remember World War I that they'll be reluctant to do anything about things going on in Europe in the 30s. So Addams becomes this very respected woman in the early 30s. She gets the Nobel Peace Prize, and all kinds of awards are showered upon her. And then she dies in 1935. So she kind of comes full circle from being this beloved person to a very despised person, and then back to being a beloved person again at the end of her life.
And now we can reclaim her story with your book, which is wonderful. What was it like for TR to have to, now TR dies just, I think, a year or so after World War I ends. What was it like for him to have to sit on the sidelines during this unbelievable adventure that the United States gets involved in?
It killed him. It killed him that Wilson was president the whole time. Even from the moment the war began, he knew it was the biggest event in 100 years, and he was not president. I think that alone made him hate Wilson even more. And then, of course, the only thing he was hoping that he could do would be to serve. He was raising a division, and he had I don't know, 35,000 men ready to go with him. But Wilson eventually said, "No, you're not going," and that was the end of that. There's some good scenes in the book where Roosevelt comes to the White House right after war is declared and has to make nice with Wilson. They have this, and they have actually a fairly pleasant chat, which is, the feelings the two of them must have had at that moment, where Roosevelt is kind of feeling him out about, are you going to let me go to Europe to serve? And Wilson doesn't give him a yes or no answer, but eventually he gives him a no answer, which is not surprising for a number of reasons. I don't think Roosevelt was even in any shape to go at that point. And I think the military itself really didn't want him. They didn't want an ex-president mucking around in Europe trying to tell people what to do, because Roosevelt would have done that. So there was also political dimensions too, that Roosevelt goes to Europe and he does something great. He's going to run for president in 1920. There were people who were believing there was going to be a big fight in 1920. Wilson was going to run for a third term. Roosevelt was going to run again. It was going to be the two of them going at it in 1920. So why give your political enemy an advantage by sending him to Europe? So there are a lot of reasons not to send him, but it really embittered Roosevelt in the last years of his life. And then his son was killed during the war as well. So it was a difficult final time for Theodore Roosevelt.
There's one person who just doesn't find his way into these kinds of books very often, and I love reading about him whenever he does show up, and that's William Howard Taft. He's overshadowed, isn't he, by Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt in World War I, and he's kind of got bookends on either side of him. Why do you think it is that Taft is just sort of a side figure in many of these dramas, and that we haven't had a new biography of him? This is me as a reader complaining, I guess, because we haven't had a new biography of Taft in a long, long time that focuses solely on Taft. Where is Taft? Well, why can't we have more of him?
He doesn't have the personality of the other two. He's not a dynamic figure. And you can even read, when you read the correspondence at the time, Wilson doesn't think much of Taft. There's a quote of Wilson writing to someone saying, Mr. Taft is really not very consistent in his views, or something like that. And then Taft, of course, though Wilson was no good either. I mean, there's all these little remarks back and forth in their private correspondence. But and then Roosevelt, of course, had been friends with Taft and had this great falling out with him in 1912, and came to dislike him. And I think Taft was, in some ways, he was sort of representing the older Republican Party. He was not a progressive, and his views were kind of old-fashioned. I mean, he's in my book a little bit here and there. Some of his comments about women's suffrage, he was totally opposed to it. I mean, so you can see he was far behind the other two in that regard. He was, however, in favor of some sort of peacemaking apparatus, and he and a group of others formed what was called the League to Enforce Peace, which was this something on the idea of the League of Nations. But Taft was not someone who felt it should have anything to do with the current war. This would be for after the war. So Taft, in that regard, was advanced. But I think, as I said, from a personality perspective, he was seen as sort of the jolly fat man in American politics at the time, and no one quite took him as seriously as the other two. Of course, he had a distinguished legal career, and I think he's someone who would have been happier if he had just been on the Supreme Court judge his whole time instead of getting into politics.
Yeah, not bothering with all this craziness in the White House. How does the way, and I guess this is coming, how does the way World War I started compare and contrast with what we're seeing right now in Ukraine?
It does remind me with the Belgian invasion in 1914. In that suddenly a sovereign country is overrun, and Americans feel very helpless about it and very upset about it. In 1914, many of them learned about it from the newspapers. There were some very, very the war correspondents who wrote very detailed accounts of Belgians being shot and things like that. And then, the question was, what should we do about this? Roosevelt later on came to believe that Wilson had totally botched this, that we should have protested, we should have done this, we should have done that. At the time, though, he didn't believe that. Later he came to believe it. But at the time, he felt, it's a tragedy. And the quote I used in the book, which Roosevelt said, he said, when giants wrestle, those in the way are going to get crushed. Little things in the way, little people in the way are going to get crushed. Meaning, Belgium is a little country, and they're in the way of these two other, these two giant sides going at it. But later on, Roosevelt said Wilson absolutely made a mistake. He should have condemned this invasion in no uncertain terms. He should have offered all aid to them. And Wilson does not. Wilson felt we are not, by treaty, have any commitment to that part of the world, as much as we may think this is a terrible thing. And maybe, again, we're seeing some of the same thing right now. We're not legally bound to do anything for Ukraine right now. They're not a NATO country. But I think a lot of Americans feel helpless and would like to do something and maybe like our government to do something. But what is it that we do? I think everyone agrees we don't want to send combat troops, and that was probably true 100 years ago with Belgium. We weren't going to send combat troops there, but we did want to do something. And you had another parallel is you had Americans signing up to fight to help the Belgians in 1914. We're seeing Americans signing up right now to help Ukraine. So there are some interesting things that tie these two events separated by 108 years together.
What did you learn from your studies about how wars start that we need to be on guard for today?
They start very quickly, and I think they can spiral out of control extremely quickly in a way that no one anticipated. I think that's really the way it happened in World War I. I don't think anyone could see what was going to happen, and that you're going to have all these regimes toppling from what started out with a relatively small incident, and something ended up changing the entire world and changing the trajectory of the 20th century. It's one of the reasons why I say that this decision for America was so important, because World War I, even though it doesn't get the hype that World War II gets, it really affected the rest of the century. And if the United States doesn't join the Allies in this war, you have all kinds of possible alternate scenarios where maybe the Germans win this war. Maybe there's some kind of negotiated settlement. And maybe there's no rise of Hitler in the 1920s. There's no Second World War. There's no, it's all kinds of things that might have occurred if the United States does not get involved in this fight. So it was a really essential and crucial decision for the United States to make, which I do believe changed the rest of the 20th century.
How does the isolationist impulse that some have today parallel the isolationist impulse of the early 1900s?
I think it's always been there in America. There's always been a very powerful strand of, America for Americans, and we don't care what's going on in the rest of the world. It doesn't affect us directly. Even after World War I, when we were so internationalist, we got involved, we sent troops. Right when after the war's over, it's almost like, okay, we're out. We don't really want to be involved again, even though we are so connected to all these countries, and we're a very important force in the global economy. But I think for many Americans, they just don't see the importance of it. It's not really part of their everyday life. They don't have a grasp of it. And I think that our leaders, our politicians, in some ways echo what their constituents want and want to pursue.
What trio of today needs a book like the one you've written?
Oh, that's a tough question. Let's see. We have to do three different ones. I guess President Biden could be one, but we need someone on a different end. How about Biden, Trump, and we need a woman as the third piece of it.
Biden, Trump, and see, now I have to think about it.
Hillary Clinton, we'll throw her in there.
Biden, Trump, and Hillary. There you go. Interesting. Or we could pick an academic. We could pick like Heather Richardson or something like that.
You could, but you need them to be, I think, connected to one another in some ways. And I think if we did those three, they would all be connected. They do have a history together of some kind, the three of them. But it's interesting. And I think the way history will be written in the future will be a little bit more difficult in the sense that we have so many documents from this period available to us. And in today's era, I don't know what, people communicate in a different way.
All these emails and phone, and you never hear about it again.
Exactly. So I think that will be a little bit more difficult to get at. And a lot of, internet stuff is not preserved,
or you need a password. I mean, there's no pile of documents. You have to have access to the password.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think that's going to be an issue.
Am I allowed to ask what might be next for you, or are you still digging out of this? Are you still digging out of this one?
Well, I've been talking to my agent about that. We're just trying to figure out what to do next. I don't really know at this point. I haven't come to any decision. This book was a lot of work.
I'm sure.
It took me almost, I think it was 5 years to research and write. So it was a tremendous amount of work to put this thing together. It was fun. The research is fun. The writing is not so fun. The writing is a lot more grueling to do. I think probably a lot of people you have on your show may say the same thing, that the research is more fun than the writing is. I mean, it's like what most authors say. They like to write when the book is done. They like to see the finished product, but the actual staring at the screen and trying to produce a certain number of words each day is hard.
Is there another time period that really interests you?
I think I'm going to stay with the 20th century.
That's 100 years, though. Narrow it down from there.
Well, I would say the first. It could be the first half. I mean, I would say I probably wouldn't touch the 19th because anything I've ever written has been what we call modern American history in academia, which is the 20th. So I would say probably in the first, 1920 to 1970, maybe.
And you've written about baseball and the Negro Leagues, and Roy Campanella. How do all the books fit together? Is there a common thread?
I think that there was a common thread with the first three, which were about the Negro Leagues. And Campanella himself played in the Negro Leagues and then, went to the major leagues and became part of the first group of African Americans who integrated baseball. Those three, I think, the first three books were linked together. This book has nothing to do with the other three. It was I think, a conscious effort to get away from sports history, which I think is not taken seriously by many people, even though I think there's some wonderful sports history work that's been done by a lot of historians, but I think it's not taken as seriously as it should be. So I wanted to try to do something outside of sports, and that's why I went in this direction with World War I.
Dr. Neil Lanctot, the author of The Approaching Storm, Roosevelt, Wilson, Adams, and Their Clash Over America's Future. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you again for having me.
Check out the book. Check out his website, neillanctot.com. And that's the standard spelling of Lanctot, right? Spelled Lanctot, neillanctot.com. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History, and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.